The flashlight beam cut through the inky blackness, dancing across crumbling plaster and cobweb-draped furniture. A guttural scream echoed from deeper within the house, followed by the clatter of something heavy falling. Sarah gasped, pressing herself against the damp, rotting wall. "Michael?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the frantic pounding of her heart. Silence. Only the frantic drip, drip, drip of a leaking pipe answered her. Her breath hitched. Just moments ago, they'd been a team. Michael's booming laugh, a comforting counterpoint to her own nervous jitters. Now, the silence was a suffocating blanket, heavy with unspoken dread. She gripped the cold, rusty doorknob, her fingers slick with a mixture of sweat and grime. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this decaying mausoleum and never look back. But Michael was in there. She pushed open the door, a low groan of tortured wood protesting her entry. The room beyond was a cavern of shadows, the faint light from the moon struggling to penetrate the grime-caked windows. Dust motes danced in her flashlight's beam, illuminated like a macabre snowstorm. A broken grandfather clock stood sentinel in the corner, its hands frozen at midnight, a mocking timestamp of their descent into this nightmare. "Michael," she tried again, her voice a little stronger this time, though it cracked on his name. A faint scuffling sound, like fabric dragging across the floor, came from behind a tattered velvet curtain. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it him? Was he hurt? Taking a shaky breath, Sarah forced herself forward, her boots crunching on what felt like shattered glass. The air grew colder, a bone-chilling dampness that seeped into her very marrow. She pulled back the curtain, revealing nothing, just a crumbling wall, and an alcove that seemed to hum with an oppressive energy. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through her ankle. She cried out, stumbling, her flashlight clattering to the floor, plunging the room into darkness once more. Panic flared, a wild, untamed fire in her chest. She scrabbled on the floor, her fingers brushing against something slick and cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the house's temperature shot through her. It was blood. Her mind raced, replaying the events that led them to this cursed place. It had started as a dare, a foolish, youthful challenge fueled by too many energy drinks and the thrill of the unknown. The old Blackwood Manor, abandoned for over 50 years, was the local legend, the place where shadows whispered and the dead refused to rest. Stories of unexplained disappearances, chilling apparitions, and a lingering tragedy clung to its decaying timbers like a shroud. Michael, always the fearless leader, had scoffed at the warnings. "It's just an old house," he'd declared, "probably full of rats and dust bunnies. Nothing a little exploration can't handle." Sarah, ever the cautious one, had tried to dissuade him, her stomach churning with a nameless dread. But the allure of proving their courage, of capturing evidence for their fledgling Urban Legends Unveiled YouTube channel, had been too strong. They had arrived at dusk, the setting sun casting long, skeletal shadows of the bare trees across the overgrown lawn. The house itself was a monstrosity of Victorian architecture, its once grand facade now a grotesque mask of peeling paint and shattered windows. A lone, gnarled oak tree stood sentry by the front gate, its branches like grasping claws against the bruised sky. As they approached, a sudden gust of wind had slammed the heavy oak front door shut with a resounding bang, despite there being no breeze a moment before. Sarah had jumped, a scream catching in her throat. Michael had just laughed. "Welcome, committee." But even he had looked a little unnerved. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and acrid. Every floorboard groaned under their weight. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe. They'd meticulously filmed their entry, Michael narrating in his usual boisterous style, trying to sound brave, though Sarah could hear the slight tremble in his voice. They had found the parlor first, A room frozen in time, coated in a thick layer of dust. An antique piano sat silently, its keys yellowed and cracked. A child's rocking horse stood motionless in the corner, its painted eyes staring blankly into the gloom. That's when the first strange incident occurred. As Michael panned his camera across the room, the rocking horse began to gently sway, as if an invisible child had just dismounted. Sarah had shrieked, clutching Michael's arm. He tried to rationalize it. Draft, probably. But there was no draft. The room was still, the air heavy and stagnant. They had quickly moved on, a nervous energy propelling them deeper into the house. They explored a kitchen, a scene of domestic disruption, with rusted pots and pans still hanging from hooks, and a shattered teacup on the floor. Then the dining room, with its grand dust-shrouded table and chairs. It was there, as Michael was adjusting his camera, that Sarah saw it. A faint, translucent figure, a woman in a long, flowing white dress, standing at the far end of the table. Her back was to them, her form almost shimmering, like heat haze. Sarah had frozen, unable to speak, unable to even breathe. When she finally managed to point, Michael had spun around, but the figure was gone. "What? What is it, Sarah?" he'd asked, his voice laced with genuine concern this time. She tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. He'd looked at her, then back at the empty space, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You're seeing things, babe. Nerves." But she knew what she had seen, and a cold dread had begun to settle in her stomach, a feeling that this was no longer a game. They had made their way upstairs, the creaking of the stairs a symphony of unease. The second floor was a labyrinth of bedrooms, each one holding a decaying tableau of a lifelong past. One room, obviously a child's, was filled with antique toys. A doll, with vacant glass eyes sitting propped against a pillow. As they entered, the doll's head had slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned to face them. This time, Michael saw it too. His face had gone pale. "Okay," he'd said, his voice flat. "Okay, that was not a draft." It was in the master bedroom, a grand room with a 4-poster bed draped in cobwebs, that they found the journal. It was tucked away in a dusty old nightstand, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The pages were filled with elegant, looping script, detailing the life of a young woman named Eleanor, the original owner of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor's entries began joyously, describing her marriage to a wealthy merchant, the birth of their beautiful daughter, Lily. But as the journal progressed, the tone grew darker. She spoke of her husband's increasingly erratic behavior, his violent outbursts, and Lily's growing fear. Then, the entries started to mention the whispers, the shadows, and a cold presence in the house. The handwriting became frantic, desperate. The last entry was chilling. "He knows. He's coming for us. Lily, my sweet Lily. There's no escape." As Michael read the final words aloud, a mournful cry had echoed through the house, a child's wail filled with unspeakable sorrow. It came from directly above them, from the attic. Michael, despite his fear, had felt a morbid curiosity, a need to understand. He wanted to find Lily. Sarah, however, wanted nothing more than to leave. But the cries continued, drawing him in, a siren song of despair. "I have to see," he'd insisted, his eyes wide with a strange mix of terror and determination. "For the channel, for Lily." Against her better judgment, Sarah had followed him to the attic door. It was a heavy, wooden door, scarred and weathered, with a rusted iron lock. As they touched it, a wave of intense cold had washed over them, carrying with it the faint scent of old roses and something else, something metallic. Michael had picked the lock with surprising ease, a skill he'd picked up in his youth. The door creaked open, revealing a cavern of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. That's when the temperature in the house plummeted, and the air grew thick with a palpable tension. They had climbed the rickety steps, the mournful cries growing louder, more desperate. It was as they reached the top that the attic had revealed its horrific secret. In the center of the dusty, cobweb-filled space, a child's wooden crib sat, untouched by time. And in the crib, a small, decaying rag doll. As they stared at it, the cries intensified, no longer from a child, but from something far older, far more malevolent. The very air around them vibrated with a raw, ancient anger. And then, the doll's vacant eyes had glowed with a faint red light. That's when it had all gone wrong. The room had suddenly erupted in a cacophony of sound. Objects flew from shelves. Unseen forces slammed doors shut, and a cold spectral wind whipped around them. Michael had instinctively raised his camera, trying to capture the chaos, but a dark, shadowy form had coalesced in the corner of the attic, growing larger, more defined, until it took on the terrifying visage of a man, his eyes burning with an unholy fire. He had screamed, not a sound of fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage, and then he had lunged at Michael. Sarah, paralyzed with terror, had watched as Michael was thrown across the room, his camera flying from his grasp. The shadowy figure had pursued him, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. Michael had fought back, grabbing whatever he could, but it was useless. The figure was an entity of pure malice. She had stumbled down the attic stairs, the cries of the entity echoing behind her. The image of Michael's terrified face burned into her mind. She ran, blindly, through the darkened house, the sounds of the struggle upstairs growing fainter, replaced by the thudding of her own heart in her ears. And that's how she found herself in this chilling room, clutching her ankle, the scent of blood in the air, Michael's scream still ringing in her ears. Her fingers finally closed around the flashlight. With a trembling hand, she clicked it on, the beam illuminating the source of her pain. A sharp shard of glass, sticking out of her boot. She pulled it out, wincing, a thin trail of blood following it. She needed to find Michael. She couldn't leave him, not after everything. Pushing through the pain, she limped towards the alcove, the one that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. As she drew closer, she felt a strong current, like a powerful electric field. She shone her light inside, revealing a small, hidden passageway, concealed behind what looked like a removable wall panel. This wasn't on any blueprints she'd seen. This was a secret, a place meant to be hidden. Taking a deep breath, Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening. The passage was dark, claustrophobic, and the air grew even colder, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and old. She moved slowly, her hands brushing against rough, cold stone. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing a disturbing sight. On the far wall, crude, unsettling symbols were carved into the stone, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. In the center of the room, a large stone altar dominated the space, and on the altar, a mummified human heart. Sarah gasped, recoiling in horror. What was this place? A hidden ritual chamber? Then she saw it. Lying beside the altar, half obscured by shadow, was Michael. He was alive, thank God, but unconscious. A dark bruise blooming on his temple. His camera lay shattered next to him. She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. It was faint, but there, he was breathing. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. But as she knelt beside him, a cold whisper snaked through the air, directly into her mind. "He took my Lily." Sarah froze. The voice was mournful, filled with an ancient sorrow, but also with a simmering rage. Then, The shadows in the room began to writhe, coalescing into the familiar, terrifying form of the man from the attic. His eyes, burning red, fixed on her. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was solid, tangible, his face contorted in a mask of grief and fury. He pointed a skeletal finger at the mummified heart on the altar. He sacrificed her, for power, for eternal life. He then gestured to himself. I was his protector, her protector, but I failed. Sarah finally understood. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a prison, a tomb of a tortured soul, eternally bound by a horrific act. The man, Eleanor's husband, had sacrificed his own daughter, Lily, in a dark ritual to gain immortality, sealing her essence within the house. The entity was a guardian, perhaps Eleanor herself, or another protector, driven mad by grief and a thirst for vengeance. The shadowy figure lunged, but this time, not at her. It moved past her, towards Michael's prone form. "No!" Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed a loose stone from the altar, her mind racing. She had to protect Michael. As the entity reached for Michael, Sarah hurled the stone with all her might, aiming for the glowing heart on the altar. It was a desperate, irrational act, born of pure adrenaline. The stone struck the mummified heart with a sickening crunch. A blinding flash of green light erupted from the altar, followed by a deafening shriek that seemed to rip the very fabric of reality. The shadowy figure recoiled, its form flickering violently, as if being torn apart by an unseen force. The symbols on the wall blazed, then cracked, sending shards of glowing stone to the floor. The room began to shake, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The air grew thick with an acrid smoke, and the unholy wail intensified, a sound of pure agony and despair. The entity writhed, its form dissolving, reforming, then dissolving again, as if battling an internal struggle. The room pulsed with energy, the symbols on the wall fading, then reappearing, then finally shattering into dust. Then, with a final, ear-splitting scream that seemed to tear through the very foundations of the house, the entity exploded into a million shimmering motes of light, which then vanished into thin air. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. The shaking stopped. The green light faded. The cold began to recede, replaced by the stagnant, musty air of a long-abandoned building. Sarah stood panting, clutching her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The chamber was still, quiet, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Michael remained unconscious, but his breathing seemed to have steadied. She knelt beside him again, her hands shaking as she gently checked his face. He was still pale, but the tension had left his features. The mummified heart on the altar was gone, reduced to a pile of ash. The symbols on the wall were no longer glowing, just faint carvings in the stone. The malevolent presence that had permeated the house, that had clung to her skin and whispered in her mind, was gone. Slowly, Michael stirred, groaning softly. His eyes fluttered open, blinking against the faint light of Sarah's flashlight. "Sarah?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. What happened?" Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it almost buckled her knees. He was awake. He was safe. "It's over, Michael," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." They managed to make their way out of the hidden chamber, back through the claustrophobic passage, and into the main house. The house felt different now. The oppressive cold was gone, the heavy silence replaced by the mundane sounds of an old, decaying building. Creaks, groans, the gentle rustle of leaves outside. The lingering scent of dread had dissipated, replaced by the familiar smell of dust and old wood. As they stumbled out of the front door, the first rays of dawn were painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange. The gnarled oak tree by the gate still stood, but its branches no longer looked like grasping claws. The house, Though still a ruin, no longer exuded the same chilling aura. It was just an old, abandoned house. They leaned against Michael's car, exhausted, bruised, but alive. Sarah looked back at the house, a shiver running down her spine despite the warmth of the rising Sunday. The Blackwood Manor had held its secrets for decades, a silent witness to a terrible tragedy. Now, those secrets had been unearthed, and the tormented souls within had finally, truly, found their rest. "We need to tell someone," Michael said, his voice still weak, but with a hint of his old determination. "Everything. The journal, the ritual, Lily." Sarah nodded, a new resolve hardening her gaze. "And we need to make sure no one else ever steps foot in that house again. Not until the truth is out." The story of Blackwood Manor and the horrors they had faced within its walls would be their most terrifying and most important upload yet. But this time, it wouldn't be for the thrill or for the views. It would be for Eleanor, for Lily, and for every soul trapped within the decaying timbers of a house that had finally, after so many years, been set free.